If you've ever been part of a detail to prepare communion for a Sunday morning worship service, you know that sometimes challenges can arise. One Sunday morning, a pastor had a knock on her office door on a Sunday when communion was going to be served, and the communion servers had a problem in that there was not quite enough grape juice to fill the cups and not enough time to run out for more. And the pastor, she thought about the circumstance, thought about the story that we just read, but didn't think that the gifts that were there to turn water into grape juice were quite in her parameters. So she did the next best thing, and she told the preparers to put a little bit of extra water in the grape juice, just enough to make it stretch. And it worked. And nobody is accused of saving the best for last, but nobody complained that morning either, which perhaps was the miracle of the day. But that happens sometimes, doesn't it? We run short on essential resources. We run out of gas. We push ourselves and we feel exhausted and dry and run down, and we feel embarrassed that we feel run down. Whenever I have a conversation with my mom, who's 90, on the phone, and I ask how she's doing, she said, well, I just don't seem to have the pep I used to. I said, well, you're kind of entitled to that, Mom, at 90. But burnout is a common side effect of the schedules that we all keep these days. Now, maybe you aren't that self-absorbed in your schedule, but you know what it's like to often be spread too thin across the activities that lay before you for a day. In your work, in your church activities, your family obligations, those social outreach obligations that you have. And sometimes it's perhaps your experience that it all becomes just too much. Sometimes it seems like there are committee meetings here every night, and I get tired and I find that my must-do list is sometimes longer than I can get done in a day, and I'm sitting there at the table looking around at other committee members, and I see other faces at these same meetings 3 or 4 nights that week, and they're feeling a bit exhausted as well. And I think about the church that has a sign posted in the conference room. It looks something like this. You know, we might run out of wine, but we can still do plenty of whining in the life of the church. It's easy when you're busy doing good things, and even when you're doing everything right, to get tired and to lose your passion, to run out of wine. And that's why John's story about the wedding in Cana speaks so powerfully to us. It's a simple story, one that perhaps you've heard many times, or perhaps you're hearing it for the first time today. But just below the surface, John lays out so many parallels to the church that it's pretty clear that he isn't telling a story about a wedding that took place once upon a time, but he's telling a story about what happens in the church every time we come together. And he even starts the story with a very significant Christian catchphrase. He begins by writing, "On the third day." Now, when you hear the words "on the third day," what's the first thing you think about? Easter resurrection, right? Jesus rose from the dead. That's the cornerstone of our faith. This is an Easter story right here in the beginning of John's gospel. Before Jesus is even getting his ministry underway, he's already looking ahead to Easter. It's a Sunday story about when a church gathers to celebrate the resurrection. Because we believe that every Sunday is Easter Sunday in the church. And so John is comparing Sunday morning worship to a Jewish wedding party. And I love that image. I need that image in my life, because sometimes our worship can feel more like one of those committee meetings than a party. There's talk about churches needing to have defibrillators on hand in case of a cardiac emergency, that we're prepared for everything, and that makes sense. But there are some times on a Sunday morning when I think we could use one of those here just to wake everybody up and to get our pulses going a little bit. If something doesn't happen when you come here once in a while to worship, that makes your pulse quicken, that makes your mind race, that perhaps makes you laugh or cry or want to shout, if nothing makes you mad or glad so that when you walk out here, you're different than when you came in, well, then you just might need a good jolt from a defibrillator. You know, it's true that worship is serious business and that it requires work for all of us. John is our liturgist this morning. Did you know that the word liturgy literally means the work of the people? So John is doing your work for you this morning. And there's not a way to get around that, but we're also called here together to celebrate the grace of God. We're here to party. And there's no party like a Jewish wedding. In those days, those weddings could last for up to a week. And so when John writes that it was the third day, this wedding had already been going on for 3 days. And Jesus and his brand new disciples were among those who were invited, and so was his mother. And so she comes to Jesus and says, the wine has run out. And perhaps this is the beginning of that saying, if Mama's not happy, there's not anybody happy. But why would Mary be unhappy? Why is this her problem? One commentator suggests that maybe Jesus and his disciples are the reason why the wine ran out so soon. Which goes with this strange rumor in the Gospels that Jesus was something of a party animal who really enjoyed being part of celebrations. Do you remember what he said? Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst of them. And the you in that I'll be with you always is plural and not singular. Jesus likes us to get together. And Jesus is with us when we come together. Not when we're off by ourselves in individual, I'm spiritual but not religious sorts of isolation, doing our own thing by ourselves. It's not a party if it's just you. So Mama says, the wine has run out. And Jesus says, so what? Whose problem is it? And literally, this is the Hebrew curse. Woman, what to you and to me? And that means, what is there between us that you think you have the right to make demands of me? You might be saying, yikes, what's going on here? Just calling someone woman is pretty strong coming from Jesus' mouth, isn't it? I once saw a t-shirt by the big dog company that read, quit hounding me, woman. Woman isn't the kind of tone of voice that we would expect from Jesus. This is the first time that John mentions Jesus' mother. And he doesn't mention her again until the cross. And never in John is Mary named by her name. She's just mentioned as Jesus' mother. And John doesn't have any birth stories in that gospel like in Matthew and in Luke. But we read this story and we can't help but think that Mary has a role in the birth of Jesus' ministry in this story. And like giving birth, there's some pain involved. And so she nags and she nudges. And Jesus and Mary have words. You know, sometimes you have to give the kids a little push to get them out of the nest to fly on their own. And I think that their exchange is just part of being family. Mary does go back to Capernaum with Jesus after this wedding, so I think they're still okay. But at the wedding, they have this exchange, and Mary ignores Jesus' reply. She just turns on her heels, and she instructs the servants and says, do what he tells you. Now, that statement jumps out of the story too, because she's not just talking to those servants in the story, but she's talking to us servants about what we must do in our lives when the wine runs out, or when we run out of cupcakes, or however you want to try and bring that analogy together. She says, do what he tells you. And what does Jesus tell us? You read through the Gospels and you find Jesus telling us all sorts of things. He tells us to pray. He tells us to love. He tells us to serve. He tells us to care for the least of these. He tells us to pull away when we need to. Not to desert, but to find rest so that we can rest and renew and return. He tells us to meet, to care for each other. He tells us to forgive, to nurture, to sustain. For our part, we're encouraged not to run away from that first exchange, because that's just part of what it means to be a family. You don't leave the party when the wine runs out. You turn to Jesus, and then you do what he tells you to do. And Jesus, the good son, wants Mama to know that he's an adult. He doesn't do miracles on demand. He makes his own decisions about the timing and the direction of his ministry. Thank you very much. Nobody controls Jesus. But Jesus, the good son, cares about what his mother cares about. And he cares about the possible embarrassment to the family who's hosting this meal, and to the joy of the young couple at their wedding. So he tells the servants to fill 6 jars with water. And these aren't ordinary jars either. They're jars used for the Jewish rites of purification, for ritual washing. You begin to put some things together and you think, water into wine? Is Jesus maybe connecting baptism and communion in this story? Or is he wanting to say that Jesus has fulfilled and renewed the ancient faith of his people? New wine has been poured into old wineskins, as Matthew would say. Only John says this is new wine in old water jars. Anyway, according to John, this is Jesus' first miracle. Only the miracle is barely mentioned in passing. John does not talk about miracles, he talks about signs. The emphasis is not on the event as much as the meaning behind it. It is a sign. It points to something else. Jesus tells the servants to fill the jars with water and then take a cup to the chief steward, who's kind of like the wedding coordinator, the guy who's in charge, who's supposed to know what's going on. He's kind of like the chief priests and scribes in Jesus' day. But he has no idea where this wine has come from. And so he credits the host. He turns to the bridegroom and says, everyone serves the good wine first, and then the bad wine after the guests have become drunk. But you kept the good wine until now. Jesus doesn't even demand any credit. The host gets the credit. Or maybe John wants to suggest that the true host at our party is Jesus himself. But the guy in charge, the steward, the wedding coordinator, he doesn't know, but John says the servants know what happened. And isn't that always the case? If you want to know what's happening, what's really going on, you talk to the custodians, or you talk to the secretaries, or you have a word with the kitchen crew. They're the ones who know. The folks in charge only think they know. They only think that they're in control. But the servants know. And in John's day, the church was not a place where powerful people, where leaders and authority figures hung out anyway. It was mostly made up of lower class folks, the dispossessed, mothers and other women, servants, the poor, the least of those who got it, who understood what was happening. They knew the source of the good wine. They knew what Jesus had done. And Jesus' disciples got it too, because we're told they saw the sign and they believed. And that brings the question to you. Do you get it? The servants know. The disciples know. Do you know where to go for the good wine? You see, this just isn't a quaint tale about how Jesus saved a party 2,000 years ago. It's God's word for the church in our day. And for us, when the wine runs out. What do you do in your life when you're running on empty? Well, the first thing you have to do is admit it. A lot of us just go on pretending, even to ourselves, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we're exhausted, we're angry, and we start snipping at our friends and our family, even people who care about us most, maybe we even blow up at somebody and dump all our frustrations on that person all at once. And we have trouble admitting that the joy is gone and that our soul is empty, that the wine has run out. And Jesus says you need to listen to what your body and your heart and your soul might be telling you. Maybe the Lord at that point is trying to tell you something. But that's what Sabbath is for. To stop, to look, and to listen at what the Lord is telling you. Remember Jesus' words in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount where he says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled." Most of all, when you find yourself running on empty, you've got to go to the source. The story of this wedding shows us where we will find help. Marcus Borg, the theologian, writes, what is the gospel, the good news of Jesus, about? Well, John answers it, it's about a wedding banquet at which the wine never runs out and where the best is always saved for last. I know that we don't allow alcoholic beverages on these premises or at church functions, and it's not just because we're sensitive to those whose lives and families have been wrecked by alcohol abuse, but it's simply because we don't need it. What John is telling us is that Jesus is the wine at our party. Jesus is one who fills us with good cheer, who makes us giddy with exuberance, who lowers our inhibitions and the walls that divide us and keep us from being honest and tender-hearted and affectionate with each other. It's Jesus who inebriates us with the presence of God, who enables us to raise up and say, "Dilly, dilly," as that commercial now is telling us. And it's almost scandalous, isn't it? To be so drunk at 11 a.m. on a Sunday morning. You remember what the outsiders said when the disciples were filled with the Spirit at Pentecost? They said, "These men are drunk. They're filled with new wine." And what was Peter's response? "These men are not drunk as you believe. It's only 9 o'clock in the morning." They didn't get it. They didn't get it. But do you get that good news this morning? What we do here is serious, but it shouldn't be somber. And sometimes we need to lighten up just a bit and let God go with it. And I think it's important for us to grab onto that word for us today. It's tough to love the unlovable. It's tough to maintain the joy, and we can't do that on our own steam. Our energy and our passion and our resources won't last unless we're in connection with the one who is the source of all good things. We have to rely on Jesus. So the word is not to separate your external well-doing with your internal well-being, which flows from Jesus Christ, the fountain of life himself. Don't leave the party where the other servants are serving the new wine of Christ. Do the work, but don't forget to celebrate as you go. There's a party there. And Jesus is our host. And he's invited us all to join the festivities. And nobody is excluded except those who choose to exclude themselves. So pray, worship, rest, serve. Find Jesus in the rhythm of life that brings joy to your being and makes you a joy to others. And when you run out of wine, don't drop out and run away. Turn to Jesus in trust and do what he tells you. The servants know. The disciples know. And soon you'll taste the new wine and the party will start up again. And you'll know too. Do you get it? Let's pray. Gracious God, help us to step back, catch our breath, and prepare ourselves for what you have prepared for us next, that we might receive the joy of your presence and be filled with all the good things that you have to offer to us. In the midst of whatever circumstances we find ourselves, you are there to turn our water into wine of celebration. Help us to be ready. In Jesus' name.